Penn with topic 2, and I'm going to start with Ron, and then we'll move to Ramsey. This particular topic is on philosophy of communication as an area of inquiry, and we pose 2 questions. The first question is, which casts in the form of landmark events or individual thinkers influence our understanding of communication as the lived immediate presence? And the second question we posed was, what do you recognize to be significant turning points in our development as a field of study that dramatically shifted our philosophizing? So Ron, if you would start.
Do you want to go first? Do you want to be okay?
Oh no, it says Ron first. No.
Okay.
Not to be too positive about it.
Following my colleagues, I'll read my remarks. The central metaphor in question is presence. In terms of the work I do, the most thorough description of the emergence of presence in communication is penned by Martin Buber's The Dialogic Principle. One can understand this question within the notion of experience and how signs within experience, particularly the work of Peirce, provide another major marker. Further, the insights of Husserl and the presence of the thing itself, and then the existential responses to the phenomenological work through Heidegger, Gadamer, Foucault, to name but a few, are also of note. Presence is tied to experience and the recognition of something that shapes and informs us outside the internal realms of the speakers. Philosophically, presence has explicated the notion of the third. The argument seldom centers on the notion of the third, but rather the presence of where the third dwells. Perhaps the starkest disagreement on the notion of presence is between Martin Buber and Emmanuel Levinas, at least in terms of my work. With Levinas rejecting the entire construct of the I-thou, unwilling to assume that communicative presence resides in a special location. Levinas counters with the phrase beyond dialogue. The presence resides beyond a dialogue in the needs of the other, the neighbor, those not seated at the table of conversation. One could study this question, of course, for a lifetime, ending up with a final conclusion. Communicative presence is not a point of agreement, but a point of contention. And where we see it sparks our perceptual engagement. In the words of multiple people who study Jewish philosophy, where one attends or discovers holy sparks or presence, illumination begins. The second part of the question, the question for me is as a personal dimension dealing with turning points. I was a student of Algis McInnes and presented a paper at his 80th birthday in Lithuania last summer. Husserl, at the time I was a student, was the president of the Husserl Circle, and he introduced me to phenomenology and existential phenomenology. And the key metaphor that he emphasized was that, of course, of understanding. That the task of phenomenology was not to tell, but to understand. This simple but elegant metaphor opens up the field of communication from one basic presupposition. What must one understand before one speaks? Philosophy of communication for me is the communicative background that must be understood before we engage discourse with others. Additionally, that background is in the midst of conversation and in reflective engagement during and afterwards. The person who puts this orientation into words, of course, is Calvin Schrag. Schrag points to the philosophy of communication and engagement propelled by the stress on by and about and for, in terms of how communicative praxis eventually results in a rhetorical turn, that philosophy of communication ultimately results in a rhetorical or persuasive engagement. Eventually, we must take the background and what it propels us into a rhetorical turn. The study for me of philosophy of communication is the preparatory material for the rhetorical turn, the material that is transformed during this rhetorical engagement, the material that is shifted and altered in reflective engagement long after, before, and during a temporal discourse. Communication, philosophy of communication is signification, a place of signification of dwelling that makes the rhetorical turn possible. And I add one other thing related to the first question. For me, philosophy of communication is tied to the discovery and the explication in public of bias and prejudice. Without bias and prejudice, as Gadamer describes it, I don't understand what philosophy of communication is. It is, in a sense, the background that propels. Otherwise, we're in a modernist project of presupposing that we can find one way to set the world straight, which then takes us to colonialism and totalitarianism.
Topic, Richard or Calvin, do you want to add on the second topic? Did you want to add at all?
Just
Turning points or?
just make a kind of a comment. Sometime in the early 70s, I was a consultant in Washington, D.C. with what's now the Agency for International Development, and they had just decided to abandon survey research around the world as a way of understanding the political nature of the countries in which we had an embassy. And prior to survey research, they had simply used local informants and daily reports back to Washington about what was going on in the culture. And so anyway, they brought a group of us together. And we were designated as communication people who did not do survey research. That was the federal government identity for what philosophy of communication was. See? So it was a negative definition, right? And I think that's the problem that has been fostered by ICA and NCA and so on. Philosophy of communication is what nobody else wants to do. And that's a Hegelian negative logic all the time, you know? It's the criticism of failure. And I think that that's where Ron is quite correct in focusing in on bias and prejudice. And I'm reminded of I.A. Richards, you know, who famously defined communication as the study of misunderstanding. That's the human part. That's where you start. You start with people and why we don't understand each other, and that allows you to move forward.
And just a brief comment to follow up on Ron's point with respect to the issue in communication being contention rather than agreement. Yeah. This, of course, was the occasion for the squabble between Jean-Francois Lyotard and Habermas. Right? On the one hand, you have rhetorical agonistics. That's the goal of communication for Lyotard. And then you have Habermas, who sets up a series of arguments mounted to lead us to some kind of consensus. I suspect, Ron, that consensus might remain as a kind of goal, but given our inextractable finitude, we can never achieve. But the two somehow play together in defining the format of everyday and technical conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Topic 3 addresses a deepening of the contribution of philosophy of communication to human communication. And so we were going to start with Ramsey, Eric, and then move to Catt. Philosophy of communication shaped the identity of communication research as a field. And what do you see as key thinkers, research areas, or communication topics that have been neglected or ignored to the detriment of our current theorizing?
Ramsey, presented. So let me see if I can consolidate what I consider to be some of the issues at stake. This is a very important issue. Yeah. The meaning of research as a field. All right, what do we mean by research as a field? One of the main things that communication does, it provides for a broadening and an enriching of what we can understand by research and field. Research becomes more than the assemblage of data, serialization of events, statistical projections, etc. And in doing so, it enriches the meaning of field as a wider interpretive context. It contextualizes the data by placing them into a wider narrative and gives a special attention to shifting historical paradigms, as Thomas Kuhn, for example, does in his book Scientific Revolution. The background issue here, has to do with the late 19th and early 20th century disputations on the role of facts and interpretation in the natural sciences on the one hand and human sciences on the other. Need to be explained. Although clearly enough, there are differences between the more qualitative features in the field of human sciences and the more quantitative features in the field of the natural sciences. There may indeed be an understanding and explanation going on in both the investigations of the human sciences and those undertaken in the researches within the sciences of nature. We indeed are of the mind that there are. And what overlaps the two, all right, what overlaps the two is an operative hermeneutic frame of interpretation, which Paul Ricoeur has articulated as a marvelous metaphor of the hermeneutical arc. The hermeneutical arc binds, if you will, what is at work in the human sciences with that which is at work in the natural sciences. Interpretation is at work in both, albeit in different postures, of course. The lesson to be learned from this is that the identity of communication as a field requires cognizance of the play of interpretation when it defines the specific markers that comprise its field of investment research. That's all.
We have about 9 or 10 minutes. Ron and Richard, if you would like to add anything?
Just a couple quick metaphors that are central to this. As some know, I'm doing a project on the Scottish Enlightenment for two reasons. One is the importance of the metaphor of sentiment and the way in which that is being played out. And secondly, I'm really pretty enamored with Catholic philosophers who work from the realm of history. And particularly in the Scottish Enlightenment, what you have is philosophical history and conjectural history. Hume does that, Ferguson does that, and so there's a historical engagement that is interesting to me. And in addition, I'm interested in the notion of historicity, again tied to Gadamer, in which I'm not interested in history in terms of its linear progression or the memorization of dates. I'm interested in history in terms of historicity. What are the questions that give identity to given moments and how we can address those? And it seems that historicity is the ongoing dwelling place of philosophy of communication, not the more conventional linear understanding of history itself. But as one might guess, you need to study history to understand historicity. Yeah.
Anything, Richard?
Well, yeah, not too much. Let me just follow what Ron is saying. I think that one of the great contributions of philosophy of communication as a scholarly community is to have re-examined the history, and which is an ongoing project, of the emergence of communication as intellectual problematic in American intellectual history, and the exploration of a lot of the work that Eicher-Catt has been doing recently, the early times of, well, when you think, for example, the Russian-Bateson book, where you have a psychiatrist and an anthropologist who make the first systematic presentation of communication, or even a book that's virtually unknown to anybody in our discipline, which is Russia's 1976 book on knowledge in action, which is a study of organizational communication. The first full-length book devoted to organizational communication before organizational communication was even a slogan within the discipline. So going back to that kind of history, and then also jumps ahead a little bit to question 4, but also the fact that we seem to, and it's only the people who are in philosophy of communication who are interested in tracing back the communication discourse problematic into history, and so it astonishes me that Charles Peirce is not on the lips of everybody, since Peirce deals with all of these modern problematics, yet he uses as his model the scholastic trivium. What could be more near and dear to the hearts of NCA people than, the trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and modernizes that into what is, now psychology and applied logic and so on, and so that the whole semiotic dimension. And then parallel to all of this too is, I've always been amazed at the American disciplinary ability to separate out speech from language, from linguistics, so that we are in a professional association that studies speech, but not any known language, much less the comparison of languages, much less what that has to do with cultural orientation, much less what that has to do with taking positions in discourse, which are called rhetoric. I just don't know how you can be a rhetorician without being a linguist. I don't know how you can be a philosopher without at least being bilingual, to understand the mechanisms by which thought is opened up. I personally viewed it as a historic tragedy when PhDs gave up the 2 language requirement, 2 foreign languages. People trained in 3 languages are very open-minded, let me assure you. People trained in statistics have no mind. It's just collection. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you all. Our final topic then is considerations for future inquiry. And we're going to start with Richard and then move to Ron, and hopefully we'll have time for others. The 2 questions here. Number 1, how does contemporary life reveal a need for philosophy of communication? And then the second question, well, actually it's 2 questions. What do you see as important future areas of philosophical inquiry about human communication? And then what avenues of current research do you see as particularly beneficial for philosophy of communication? And we'll start with Richard.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I've found most interesting about contemporary life is how modern technology has become highly regressive And, you know, it's the Foucault line there, the forgetfulness of rationality is run amok. And the way I can focus in on this is things like Facebook, but most particularly, let me talk about Twitter. You know, Twitter has discrete physical limitations, right? Number of characters. So when you design software for that, now who do you hire? Well, do you know who was hired to do the original schematics, the concepts for that? A couple of guys from Oxford who were specialists in, of all things, ars dictamus, the art of writing in the 11th century. Yeah, the ars dictamus was, how could you put everything into one page in a letter? So these guys were trained in the classical models of how do you take ideas and put them into a set number of characters. These guys are great at software. Not you know, some gamer from San Diego who's now got a BA in gaming. They can't write the software. So what's happened with technology, you'll find that the idea people in modern technology are right out of the scholastic world, all of them. So now if you look at any of the job descriptions for Microsoft or whatever, what graduate do they want? They want BA liberal arts graduates, preferably in the humanities. They need people with ideas that can be put into the software, because the software doesn't require any thinking. So I'm kind of back to my old theme there. So where do you see, where do you see this? And then, well, let me just do one more little aphorism kind of thing. When the internet became international, the Chinese government made an official complaint that the language of the internet was English. Right? They made this protest in the late 70s. That protest was never really adjudicated, but in 2004, the objection was withdrawn by the Chinese government. They didn't object to English being the language of the internet anymore. And the question is why? Because it didn't matter anymore. There were more users of Chinese in China at that point, online in Chinese, than the rest of the world combined in English. It simply didn't matter anymore which language was dominant by ideology, because by numbers of users, the market was in Chinese now. So I think when I use that example, that sometimes the idea of communication and its linguistic constraints are sort of false idols. It really does come back to lived experience. What becomes important for the technology is how to use it. So I think what happens is we go through learning curves, right? I mean, Twitter is the one thing going, and then Facebook, and now Facebook is becoming the internet. It's all becoming everything, and pretty soon everything's going to be on your wristwatch, right? But that technology does nothing to solve the basic problem. Have you got anything to say, and how do you say it? That's never going to go away. So the second part of this, future areas and so on and so on, I think it's inevitable that philosophy becomes internationalized, it becomes cultural, that you begin to read widely in the literature of other countries and traditions. I mean, my own interest is in China, so I read a great deal of Chinese philosophy, and to a certain extent Indian philosophy. And these are systems of thinking that are completely different from the West. And so once you combine things like foreign language studies, ways of thinking, I think you see the future as full of answers, because other cultures, other ways of thinking are innovative by comparison. And it's kind of what Ronald was talking about. When you have bias and prejudice, and you encounter a language and a system of thought that doesn't even see the problem of bias or prejudice, but has already moved beyond it in some way. You know, just to kind of tag in on a little previous discussion, we were talking at the point of consensus, right? Is consensus possible or not? That's an incredibly Western problem. In China, in Chinese culture, there's never a problem with consensus because the Chinese believe consensus is not possible by definition. So if you can't reach consensus, what can you do? You can have emotional harmony. So the cultural principle is harmony. We may not agree on anything, but we can still be nice to each other. And the culture is structured that way. If this was a room in China and two of you got into an argument and were screaming at each other, there would be a felt social obligation of somebody in the audience to stand up and say, cool down, you know, you people don't agree with each other, but I think that in the harmony of the group, that is to say, the rest of us would like you to calm down so that we can get on with our business. And that's how Chinese, there are flare-ups in meetings all the time, but they're immediately quashed by third parties speaking for the group. And I think that's a wonderful point of view. A few Americans could make use of that technique. I'll leave it at that.
This is a lot of fun. Thank you, Richard. I'm going to read my remarks and try to do them quickly. I'm okay on time.
You are.
If we think we live in, hopefully it's somewhat connected to Richard's, but not as eloquent. If we think we live in an era in which the correct answers have been discerned, and our task is one of implementation and fellowship alone, then the study of philosophy of communication simply should not beckon us. Of course, I view this historical moment as confused, problematic, and like bleak moments on the edge of an abyss. Therefore, the study of philosophy of communication that examines biases, assumptions, and frameworks of signification is absolutely necessary. One of my favorite lines comes from Richard Bernstein, who wrote Beyond Objectivism and Relativism, to name one of his important works. That we live in a curious time in which the philosophical and the practical have crisscrossed. I view philosophy of communication as a practical necessity for understanding and engaging the world before us, one that has helped, that we have helped, I have helped, become confounded, confused, corrupted, and at its best, a glorious place of learning. Or B. If a graduate student came to me and asked the question above, what's the future of PhilComm? I think my answer would have three coordinates. Read a great deal. Not only about philosophies, but about the people who generated them and the historical moments in which they lived and engaged their theories in response to the problems before them. Second, the second coordinate would be to live, to enjoy your life, to love your family, your friends, the kind of opportunities to travel and to get to know so much more beyond where you are. And the third would be to have hobbies. Hobbies within the humanities that stir your soul. As my good colleague Arnett talks about leisure. Leisure is the doing activity with a musical instrument, whether that be a voice or in the case of Arnett, a violin. Philosophy of communication requires you to read, to live, and to embody the humanities. Or be, as my colleague to my right, a poet of communication. My reading of philosophy, history, has been engaged in a given moment by living life with a passion and a commitment that does not allow one to forget how precious each day is. By taking the time to embody the humanities, we find new directions that happen somehow organically, not instrumentally. Philosophy of communication needs to be understood and engaged. It cannot be falsely constructed. It is not simply another form of social construction. I think at this moment of a colleague by the name of Bernie Baranek, and I miss him dearly, who reminded me every day of the importance of reading. When he greeted me, his first comment was not hello, it was, Ron, what have you read? And then he took time to talk about what he was reading. Living the incredible joy of meeting each day and the people around us, I remember being so fortunate to have one of my mentors in my own PhD program who modeled such conviction. Fortunate enough to room for over 20 years at conferences at the National Communication Association with Paul Bose. And never once when I met him did I think that life was undervalued. He reminded me of the importance of the everyday. In addition to my colleague Arnett and I have just a bit more. I think of my colleague Janie Harden-Fritz, who when she sings in a way that her soul vibrates. She embodies the humanities. There are many others like Bernie Baranek and Arnett and Paul Bose and Janie Harden-Fritz who point to a philosophy of communication that does not shy away from something that is so much more important than information, signification and meaning, that seeks to find the revelatory within ideas in life itself. We have enough people who seek to impose on this earth. It is better perhaps to be more prudent, to listen, to wait, and then take the risk, in Richard's terms, of taking a position rhetorically. But the answers are difficult in philosophy of communication and simultaneously easy. We must read, live, and do the humanities. And all the time we're reading, we're living and doing the humanities. One rejects one impulse, and that is the impulse of going. My precious, my precious, my precious possession is the danger of a philosophy of communication that ceases to inform and seeks then to impose. Thank you.